Look, I've spent a lot of my time with folks who do the hard work, the dirty work, the kind of work that keeps this country running. And let me tell you, few jobs are as essential or as iconic as the American truck driver. These are the men and women who move the goods that stock our shelves, the parts that build our cars, and the materials that raise our homes. For generations, trucking wasn't just a job, it was a calling. It was a tangible piece of the American dream, a way for someone with a strong back and a good work ethic to build a life, support a family, and be their own boss. The open road represented freedom, and owning your own rig was the ultimate symbol of that independence. The owner-operator has always been the backbone of this industry. These are the entrepreneurs of the highway, the small business owners who invest their life savings into a massive piece of machinery to haul freight across the country. They take on the risk, they manage the maintenance, they pay for the fuel, and they reap the rewards. It was a tough life, no doubt, but it was an honest one. For decades, if you were willing to put in the hours and take care of your truck, you could make a very good living. You weren't just a number on a dispatch sheet, you were the captain of your own ship, charting your own course toward prosperity. This ideal was built on a simple, powerful premise. Your hard work would directly translate into your success. If you ran more miles, you made more money. If you kept your truck in top shape, you had fewer breakdowns and more time on the road earning a living. This sense of control and ownership is what drew so many to the profession. It was a meritocracy on wheels. You didn't need a fancy degree or a corner office to succeed. You needed grit, common sense, and the willingness to see the country through your windshield, 1 mile marker at a time. This was the promise of trucking, and for a long time, it was a promise the industry kept. But somewhere along the way, that promise got broken. The road to success got a lot rougher, and the dream of being a truly independent owner-operator started to feel more and more like a fantasy. The freedom that once defined the job began to be replaced by a new kind of servitude, one that was cleverly disguised as an opportunity. The very thing that made the job so appealing, the chance to own your truck and be your own boss, was twisted into a tool to control drivers, not empower them. The story of what happened is a cautionary tale about how progress can sometimes leave the most important people behind. It's a simple fact of economics. If you do the same hard work but get paid less for it year after year, something is fundamentally wrong. That's exactly what has happened to truck drivers over the last 30 or 40 years. When you adjust for inflation, the average trucker today makes significantly less than their counterparts did in the late 1970s. Think about that for a second. The job hasn't gotten any easier. The hours are still long, the time away from family is still a sacrifice, and the risks are still very real. Yet the financial reward for that sacrifice has dwindled, making it harder and harder for drivers to get ahead, let alone achieve that dream of comfortable independence. This isn't just a feeling, the numbers back it up. Back in the golden era, a driver who owned his rig could reliably clear a profit that allowed for a middle-class lifestyle, savings for retirement, and money to reinvest in his business. It was a skilled trade that was compensated accordingly. But as the years went on, the rates for hauling freight started to fall. The slice of the pie going to the person actually doing the work got smaller and smaller. This created immense pressure on drivers, especially the independent ones who had to cover all their own costs: fuel, insurance, tires, and the endless list of repairs that come with running a 40-ton machine. The decline in pay changed the entire dynamic of the job. It turned what was once a career into a constant struggle to stay afloat. Instead of planning for the future, many drivers were just trying to survive the next week. The freedom of the open road started to feel more like a cage, as drivers had to run harder and longer just to make the same amount of money they used to. This financial squeeze made them vulnerable. When you're desperate to make ends meet, you're more likely to take a deal that sounds too good to be true, hoping it's the lifeline you've been looking for. This erosion of pay and security set the stage for a much bigger problem. It created a workforce that was overworked, underpaid, and desperate for a better way. The big trucking companies saw this desperation not as a problem to be solved, but as an opportunity to be exploited. They knew drivers still held onto that dream of owning their own truck, and they figured out a way to sell them that dream, but on terms that would benefit the company far more than the driver. The dream was still the same, but the path to get there was about to become a nightmare. To understand how things got so sideways, you have to go back to a piece of legislation called the Motor Carrier Act of 1980. Now, I'm no policy expert, but I know that when the government changes the rules of the game, there are always winners and losers. Before 1980, the trucking industry was heavily regulated. The government set the rates for shipping goods, which meant there was a stable, predictable floor for what a driver could earn. It also limited the number of new companies that could enter the market, which protected the small, independent operators from being swamped by massive corporations. It wasn't a perfect system, but it provided a level of stability. The 1980 Act, signed with the goal of increasing competition and lowering costs for consumers, essentially threw all those rules out the window. It deregulated the industry, allowing anyone to start a trucking company and letting the free market set the prices. On the surface, this sounds like a good thing. Competition is supposed to be healthy, right? But in this case, it triggered a race to the bottom. Huge new trucking companies, the mega carriers, sprang up. With their massive fleets and economies of scale, they could afford to haul freight for much cheaper than the small guy, the independent owner-operator. This new, hyper-competitive environment was brutal for the little guy. Suddenly, small family-owned trucking businesses and individual owner-operators were forced to compete with giants. The rates they could charge for a load plummeted as they were constantly underbid by the larger companies. Many couldn't keep up. They saw their profits vanish, and thousands of small trucking businesses that had been around for generations were forced to shut their doors. The very backbone of the industry, the independent driver, was being systematically crushed under the weight of this new, deregulated world. The result was a massive consolidation of power. The industry shifted from being a collection of many small businesses to being dominated by a few corporate behemoths. And these large companies had a problem. They needed a constant supply of drivers for their ever-growing fleets, but they also wanted to keep their labor costs as low as possible. They didn't want employees with benefits, sick pay, and retirement plans. They wanted the flexibility and low overhead of using independent contractors. This is where a truly predatory idea began to take root. An idea that would leverage the driver's dream of ownership against them. So you have a lot of drivers who are struggling to make ends meet, but they still dream of owning their own truck. And you have these giant trucking companies that need drivers, but don't want the costs associated with having employees. This is the fertile ground where the lease purchase agreement grew. The companies started offering a deal that sounded like the answer to every driver's prayers. You don't have the credit or the down payment to buy a truck? No problem. Lease one from us. Drive for us and a portion of your weekly earnings will go toward paying off the truck. At the end of the lease, the truck is yours. On the surface, it looks like a golden ticket. It's a path to ownership for people who couldn't get a conventional loan from a bank. The company presents itself as a partner, someone who believes in you enough to give you a shot at the American dream. They sell it as an upgrade from being a company driver. You're not an employee anymore. You're an independent contractor, a business owner. You're on your way to becoming a true owner-operator, just like the legends of the industry. It's an incredibly powerful and seductive sales pitch, especially to someone who feels stuck and sees this as their only way out. But here's the fundamental, glaring conflict of interest that makes these deals so dangerous. The same company that holds the lease on your truck, the one you owe money to every single week, is also the company that controls your income. They decide what loads you get, how many miles you run, and how much you get paid for that work. You are completely dependent on them for your ability to make the very payments they demand from you. This isn't a partnership, it's a system where one party holds all the power. They are your bank and your boss, and that is a recipe for disaster. This structure creates a perverse incentive for the company. If you succeed and actually pay off the truck, the company loses a dedicated driver and a source of weekly lease revenue. But if you fail, if you fall behind on payments and have to walk away from the lease, the company gets the truck back. They keep all the money you've already paid, and they can then turn around and lease that same truck to the next hopeful driver, starting the whole cycle over again. The system isn't designed for the driver to win. It's designed to churn through drivers and maximize profit for the carrier. When a driver signs a lease purchase agreement, they're often handed a mountain of paperwork filled with dense legal language that would make a lawyer's head spin. They're told it's a standard agreement, and honestly, they're often pressured to sign it quickly so they can get on the road and start earning. But buried in that fine print is a minefield of clauses designed to put the driver at an extreme disadvantage. The contracts are almost always non-negotiable. You either sign it as is or you walk away from the opportunity you've been promised. It's an offer you can't refuse, but one you probably should. One of the biggest traps is the price of the truck itself. The carriers often inflate the value of the used trucks in their lease programs, charging drivers far more than the vehicle is actually worth on the open market. On top of that, the interest rates are often sky high, much higher than what you'd get with a traditional loan. So right from the start, the driver is in a deep financial hole, paying a premium for an aging asset. The weekly lease payments are just the beginning. The contract almost always requires the driver to pay for all maintenance, repairs, insurance, fuel, and permits out of their own pocket. The maintenance costs are particularly brutal. These are often older trucks with hundreds of thousands of miles on them, and well, things are bound to break. When a company driver's truck has a problem, the company pays for the repair. But under a lease purchase agreement, the driver is on the hook for everything. A single major repair, like a blown engine or a transmission failure, can cost tens of thousands of dollars. The contract often forces the driver to have these repairs done at the company's own shop, where prices can be inflated. If the driver can't afford the repair, they can't work. And if they can't work, they can't make their lease payment, putting them on the fast track to default. Then there are the so-called walkaway leases, which are marketed as being low risk. The company says if it's not working out, you can just walk away, no strings attached. But the fine print tells a different story. Walking away often triggers massive penalties. The driver might be on the hook for a huge balloon payment, or they might be charged for excessive wear and tear on the truck. The company can, and often does, report the default to credit bureaus, destroying the driver's credit rating and making it nearly impossible for them to get financing for anything in the future. They walk away with no truck, no money, and a ruined financial future. The financial reality for drivers trapped in these lease purchase programs is, honestly, pretty grim. Let's talk about real numbers for a second. Studies have found that drivers in these schemes earn less than 1/3 of the industry average per mile compensation. While a typical employee driver or a true independent owner-operator might be earning a decent wage, the lease purchase driver is often barely scraping by. A huge chunk of their gross earnings is immediately deducted by the company before they ever see a dime. The weekly statement they receive is a dizzying list of deductions: the truck payment, insurance, maintenance escrow, fuel advances, and various administrative fees. What's left after all those deductions is often shockingly little. In many cases, it's nothing at all. It is incredibly common for drivers in these programs to end a long, hard week of work with a negative paycheck. That's right. After driving thousands of miles and being away from their family for days, they actually owe the company money. They have worked for free and then some. This creates a cycle of debt peonage, where the driver has to keep working for the company just to try and pay off the debt they've accumulated, digging themselves deeper and deeper into a financial hole with each passing week. The success rate of these programs tells the whole story. Research from government task forces and driver advocacy groups suggests that the number of drivers who actually complete the lease and gain ownership of the truck is shockingly low. Some estimates put the success rate at fewer than 1 in 100. Think about that. These programs are marketed as a path to ownership, yet they are structured in a way that ensures over 99% of participants will fail. This isn't a bug in the system, it's the primary feature. The business model is built on driver failure, not driver success. The human cost of this is devastating. Drivers lose their life savings. They rack up insurmountable debt. Their credit is destroyed, making it impossible to buy a car or a home. The stress takes a massive toll on their physical and mental health, and on their families. They are left with nothing to show for their hard work, but a sense of betrayal and despair. They were sold a dream of independence, but what they got was a nightmare of modern-day indentured servitude. The open road, once a symbol of freedom, became their prison. For years, drivers have been sounding the alarm about these predatory practices, but their voices were often drowned out by the powerful lobbying of the big trucking corporations. But finally, the government started to listen. In 2023, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, or FMCSA, created something called the Truck Leasing Task Force. This wasn't just another committee. It was made up of real experts, independent drivers, representatives from labor unions, consumer protection advocates, and legal experts who understood the problem from the inside out. Their job was to take a hard, honest look at these lease purchase agreements. After more than a year of investigation, collecting testimony from countless drivers, and analyzing the data, the task force delivered its final report to Congress in January of this year, 2025. And their conclusion was not ambiguous. It was a clear, direct, and powerful condemnation of the entire system. The report unanimously recommended a complete and total ban on carrier-controlled lease purchase agreements. They didn't mince words. They called these programs irredeemable tools of fraud and driver oppression that were actively harming drivers and weakening the entire American supply chain. The task force identified the core problem as the unavoidable conflict of interest I mentioned earlier, where the company is both the driver's lender and their sole source of income. They found that these agreements were intentionally designed to ensure drivers would fail, allowing companies to profit from a revolving door of hopeful but ultimately exploited labor. They pointed out that this isn't just a financial issue, it's a safety issue. A driver who is broke, exhausted, and worried about making their truck payment is not a safe driver. They are more likely to push themselves past their limits, skip essential maintenance, and put everyone on the road at risk. The report was a landmark moment. It was official government recognition of what drivers have been screaming for decades. It validated their experiences and put the blame squarely where it belongs, on the predatory structure of the agreements themselves. The task force argued that simply trying to regulate these programs with more disclosure rules wouldn't be enough. The fundamental conflict of interest is so toxic, they argued, that the only real solution is to eliminate them entirely. This was a bold stance, and it sent shockwaves through the industry, drawing a clear line in the sand between those who want to protect drivers and those who profit from their exploitation. The reaction to the task force's report perfectly illustrates the deep divide in the trucking world. On one side, you have the drivers and their advocates who hailed the report as a long overdue victory for justice. The Owner-Operator Independent Drivers Association, or OIDA, which represents the interests of small business truckers, threw its full weight behind the recommendation for a ban. For them, this was vindication. They have been fighting this battle for years, filing lawsuits and lobbying Congress to shine a light on these scams. They see the report as a critical first step toward restoring fairness and dignity to the profession. These groups argue that the so-called driver shortage we hear so much about in the news is a myth. The problem isn't a lack of people willing to drive trucks. The problem is a lack of good, sustainable jobs that treat drivers with respect and pay them a fair wage. The turnover rate in the industry is astronomically high, especially at the big carriers that rely on these lease purchase schemes. Drivers get chewed up and spit out by the system, and new ones are constantly being recruited to take their place. If you fix the pay and the working conditions, they argue, you'll fix the shortage overnight. On the other side of the divide, you have the big corporate trucking associations, like the American Trucking Associations and the Truckload Carriers Association. Unsurprisingly, they have a very different take. They defend lease purchase agreements, claiming they are a legitimate and valuable pathway to truck ownership for drivers who might not otherwise have the opportunity. They argue that a complete ban would be an overreach and would hurt the very drivers it's intended to help by taking away an option. They prefer a solution that involves more education and better disclosure, rather than outright prohibition. Of course, it's hard to ignore the fact that these associations represent the very companies that profit handsomely from these programs. Their defense of the status quo is a defense of their members' business models. They portray the problem as being caused by a few bad apples, not a rotten system. But the evidence from the task force and the stories from thousands of drivers suggest otherwise. It's a fundamental disagreement about the nature of the problem. Is it a few flawed contracts, or is it a systemically predatory model that needs to be dismantled? The battle lines have been drawn, and the future of countless drivers hangs in the balance. So, where do we go from here? The task force has made its recommendation, but that's just the first step. Now the real work begins. The future of trucking doesn't have to be a race to the bottom. We can rebuild this industry to be one that values the hard work of its most essential people. The path forward requires courage, common sense, and a commitment to fairness. First and foremost, Congress and federal regulators need to take the task force's report seriously and act on its recommendations. An outright ban on these predatory lease purchase agreements would be the cleanest, boldest, and most effective solution. If a full ban proves to be politically difficult, then the alternative must be ironclad regulation. We're talking about strict rules that shift the power back toward the driver. This would mean requiring complete transparency in contracts, with all costs, fees, and interest rates disclosed in plain, simple language. It would mean capping interest rates and banning inflated truck prices. It would mean giving drivers the right to have their trucks serviced at an independent shop and ensuring they have a clear, fair path to dispute charges. Essentially, it means treating the lease like a real financial agreement, with all the consumer protections that come with it. We also need to strengthen the support systems for drivers. This could mean more robust backing for drivers' unions and associations like OIDA, which give drivers a collective voice to fight for their rights. It also means creating legitimate pathways to ownership that don't involve these predatory leases. This could look like government-backed loan programs for aspiring owner-operators, or partnerships with credit unions to provide fair financing for commercial trucks. We need to give drivers a real shot at the dream, not a counterfeit version designed to entrap them. Ultimately, this is about restoring the promise of the open road. It's about ensuring that a hard day's work earns an honest day's pay. The men and women who haul this country's freight deserve more than debt and despair. They deserve opportunity, they deserve respect, and they deserve a fair chance to build a life of independence and prosperity. The fight is far from over, but for the first time in a long time, there's a clear map for a better route forward. It's a long haul, but it's a journey worth taking for the soul of an American industry.